In 1985, a kid could leave the house after breakfast, ride 3 neighborhoods away, drink from a stranger's hose, build a ramp out of stolen plywood, crash his bike in a gravel alley, spend an hour at the creek, eat lunch at someone else's house, disappear again, and still not be considered missing. Nobody called, nobody tracked him, nobody knew his exact location. But everybody knew the deadline. When the streetlights came on, childhood had exactly one instruction: go home. That rule was never written down. No parent posted it on the refrigerator. No municipality encoded it into ordinance. Formal juvenile curfews used clock times, not light levels. The streetlight curfew lives somewhere else entirely, in the shared understanding of every kid on the block, cross-family and cross-neighborhood, passed between children the way territory gets passed, not by instruction, but by absorption. An oral history recorded at Eastern Michigan University in 2023 captured it plainly. Tom Dewsbeber, who grew up in Ypsilanti in the 1950s and 60s, described his childhood this way. Back in the day where, you go out and play and you come home when the streetlights come on and ride our bikes and try not to get into too much trouble. 5 decades later, the phrasing is still immediate, still present tense in memory. An academic study on cross-cultural, intergenerational play narratives documented the same phrase verbatim across communities. It's like when the streetlights come on, you have to be in the house. The rule required no enforcement because children had already internalized it as part of the operating contract of outdoor freedom. You could have everything the day offered, and the day offered a great deal, so long as you surrendered it at dusk. For many kids who grew up in suburban America in the 1970s and early 1980s, the childhood territory was specific and large. There was the block, but the block was just the base. Beyond it lay the next block, the schoolyard after hours, the vacant lot at the end of the street where someone's father had never built the garage he'd planned since 1968. There was the creek under the overpass. No posted access, no liability waiver, no adult in sight. Construction sites, which in those years of suburban expansion seemed to sprout every few streets, were essentially unsupervised adventure parks. Drainage ditches flooded in spring and became navigable. Environmental psychologist Roger Hart mapped exactly this kind of territory in a Vermont community in the mid-1970s. What he found was striking. Most of the children he interviewed had places they regularly visited that their parents had never been to. Not secret in the locked diary sense, but secret in the older sense, places that belonged to children because adults simply weren't there. When Hart returned to the same community 35 to 40 years later, those zones had contracted dramatically. The places children owned had become places adults managed. In 1969, 48% of children ages 5 to 14 walked or bicycled to school. By 2000, that number had fallen to 13%. The trajectory of that single statistic describes the entire arc. The bicycle was the engine of the territory. In 1963, Schwinn introduced the Stingray, banana seat, high-rise handlebars, coaster brake, available initially in dark metallic purple, and formalized what California kids had already been building by hand, bikes that looked like motorcycles and felt like freedom. The Stingray ran for roughly 18 years before Schwinn discontinued it in 1981. By then, BMX culture had already emerged from the parking lots and empty fields of Southern California, kids on modified 20-inch bikes turning whatever flat surface existed into a course. When E.T. the Extraterrestrial hit theaters in 1982, the BMX bike on screen wasn't product placement. It was documentary. Every kid in the audience recognized it as their own. What a bike actually did was multiply the territory. On foot, a child could reach maybe 6 blocks in any direction before the effort became notable. On a bike, the range expanded to entire neighborhoods, adjacent towns, the road that bent past the edge of the subdivision and kept going. No helmets. Commercial bicycle helmets didn't begin production until 1975, and no state would pass a mandatory helmet law for children until California proposed one in 1986, covering only kids under 5, before Georgia became the first state to require helmets for those under 16 in 1993. Through the 1970s and well into the 1980s, a kid on a bike was a kid on a bike. No pads, no GPS, no parent tracking an icon across a phone screen. The playing card clothespin to the spokes made a sound that carried down the block, a mechanical flutter that meant someone was moving through the neighborhood with purpose and no particular destination. One person who grew up in this era described it directly. The sound of the card on the spokes was more than just a noise. It represented a sense of freedom and adventure. It was a signal that I was out there. Sustenance was informal and largely improvised. The garden hose nearest to wherever you were solved thirst. Nobody thought twice about it. Corner stores had penny candy displayed in glass jars, described in one candy history as dazzling gemstones, and the whole transaction was manageable on whatever coins were in a pocket. Lunch might happen at your own house or at someone else's, depending entirely on where you were when hunger arrived. Nobody called ahead. The informal food-sharing culture of those neighborhoods operated on surplus goodwill. There was almost always a parent somewhere who would feed whatever children appeared. Coming home filthy was the baseline condition. Scraped knees were treated with hydrogen peroxide and regarded as evidence of a productive afternoon. What made all of this possible, and this is the argument that nostalgia usually skips, wasn't the absence of supervision, it was the distribution of it. In 1970, approximately 48% of American children lived with a stay-at-home mother. By early 1980, more than 17 million mothers of children under 18 were in the workforce, a 44% increase from a decade earlier. But in the earlier part of this era, most suburban neighborhoods still had a significant density of adults physically present during the day. On porches, in yards, visible through kitchen windows. Any adult could see a child. Any neighbor could recognize a face and know whose kid it was. The National Neighborhood Watch Program, created in 1972 by the National Sheriff's Association, formalized what the porch culture had been doing informally for years. By 1982, more than 50,000 volunteers across New York City alone were active in some form of civilian patrol, a tenfold increase from the mid-1970s. Children weren't invisible. They were watched from 1,000 angles simultaneously, none of them intrusive, because none of them were continuous. Robert Putnam documented what happened when that social fabric began to thin. His 1995 paper and 2000 book, Bowling Alone, tracked the decline of American social capital, the network of casual human ties that constitute a functioning neighborhood. The percentage of Americans who reported socializing with their neighbors more than once a year fell slowly and steadily. Neighborhood parties and informal get-togethers, Putnam observed, vanished almost unnoticed. As that ambient adult presence thinned, the informal surveillance network thinned with it, and what had been distributed trust was replaced by concentrated anxiety. Several unrelated structural forces converged across roughly 15 years to dismantle the operating system, and they didn't need to coordinate to be devastating in combination. In the early 1980s, a series of high-profile child abductions, most visibly the murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh in Hollywood, Florida, on July 27, 1981, generated sustained and amplified media coverage that reframed the baseline risk of childhood in American public consciousness. Historian Paul Renfro, in his dissertation on the politics of child safety in the Reagan era, documented how the 1980s Child Safety Campaign authored an array of new instruments intended to protect young Americans, launched by bereaved parents and eventually sanctioned at the federal level. By 1984, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had been founded. Around the same time, a Des Moines dairy reportedly began printing photos of missing children on milk cartons, and the program expanded nationally. The face of a missing child appeared every morning at the breakfast table. The panic was real, but it was shaped in part by which missing children received coverage and which didn't. That asymmetry points to something important. The streetlight curfew experience wasn't universal. In a lot of suburban and semi-rural neighborhoods, the rule operated exactly as described: understood, internalized, and largely self-enforcing. But for Black children in the same era, the geography of freedom was drawn differently. The boundaries of where a child could safely roam weren't set by streetlight signals. They were set by race and the specific neighborhood and who was watching and with what intention. Urban children navigated different terrain than suburban ones. Denser, more trafficked, sometimes more dangerous, sometimes more socially rich, but not the same world. For children in genuinely unsafe environments or in strict households, or in rural areas where distances made the bike itself a different kind of challenge. The suburban narrative of boundless summer afternoons was at best partial. Any honest account of what was lost has to hold that not everyone had the same thing to lose. Lenore Skenazy, in Free-Range Kids, noted the statistical reality underneath the fear that ended the era for those who had experienced it. America's crime rate in the 2000s was roughly comparable to what it had been in 1970. The danger hadn't grown proportionally to the perception of it, but perception drove behavior. Parents who had been children in these same neighborhoods, who had drunk from those same hoses and ridden those same bikes without incident, began making different calculations for their own children. Air conditioning pulled families indoors and off porches. Working parents left fewer adults in daylight neighborhoods. Video games offered compelling alternatives to the creek. Organized youth sports leagues replaced pickup games. By the 1980s and 1990s, structured programs for younger children were expanding rapidly, and childhood leisure increasingly required a schedule, a vehicle, and an adult to drive it. Suburban design spread further from walkable cores. Each force took a small amount of territory away. Together, they took most of it. Paula Fass, in The End of American Childhood, published by Princeton University Press in 2016, traced this shift through the full arc of American parenting history. Her argument? Since the Republic's founding, independence and self-definition had been central to how Americans understood childhood. The managed child, supervised and scheduled at every hour, represented a departure from something genuinely distinctive about American childhood for 2 centuries. Protection, she wrote, had become more important to parents than independence, more important than giving children the freedom to choose their own futures. Jonathan Haidt, in The Anxious Generation, published in 2024, documented what this shift produced: a generation of children with measurably higher rates of anxiety and depression, raised in environments where risk had been systemically removed. The connection between unsupervised play, independent mobility, and the development of confidence, resilience, and social competence appears across multiple researchers' work. Children who move through their neighborhoods independently are significantly more physically active. They develop better spatial cognition. They engage more with peers. The freedom wasn't accidental. It was developmental infrastructure. Hart, who had spent years mapping the secret places of an earlier generation of children, later asked modern children to identify their own. One child called to his mother for help answering the question. Hart described this as inconceivable 30 years earlier. The secret place was the point. The unsupervised distance was the point. You had to go somewhere your parents didn't know about before you could come back and be known by them again. The streetlight was a small thing, a bulb on a pole, a buzz in the summer air. But to a kid on a bike, it meant the kingdom was closing. The woods, the creek, the alley, the schoolyard, the empty lot, all of it had to be surrendered until tomorrow. And maybe that is why people remember it so clearly. The streetlight didn't take away freedom. It proved how much freedom the day had given them. Subscribe for more stories like this.